All right. So, for a pretty long time, I was thinking about presenting something in English, and for also a longer period of time, I was thinking about explaining a little bit what I am teaching those groups at this private university that I work sometimes for, the higher school of trade and services. That would be Wyższa Szkoła Handlu I Usług. So I decided I was hesitating before because the whole course, the whole set of lectures on economic history and economic geography is pretty ample in content, and I think that it would be nearly impossible to sum up it all in, let's say, 40 minutes or even an hour. But today, uh, this very day, on this very day, I was summarizing it anyway for the students before, because I wanted them to make a small repetition and to prepare them more for the exam. The exam will take place on February the 11th, and I really dislike giving, as the British say, bad marks, or as the Americans say, uh, bad grades. So, in order to make their chances bigger and better on the day of the exam, I decided to summarize a little bit what we were discussing, just in general terms, not everything, not every detailed information, because it would be, of course, impossible. But and after that, and they really appreciated it. And since many of you also asked me about the particulars about those lectures, mainly privately on Facebook and not so much in public, but still, I've got many questions about what I'm actually lecturing about this semester. So, in order to also answer this question, and I think that could be also interesting to you. And since I'm lecturing about all that, since I'm teaching it all in English, so it would be for me more easy to also summarize it in English for you. So it would be something like a summary of the summary. So, okay, so without further ado, uh, I will I will say what we had during this summary today, and those were I started with the thing that I remember, that all that what I will say now I have already went through with the group in more detailed way before, so it's just a summary, and for you it's just a summary of a summary, so it's not 100% equivalent of what I was teaching, but in general terms. So in general terms, I started with what I was starting, of course, before, um, many weeks ago, when I started with the entire set of lectures. So, with our meetings, I started with the term free trade, because free trade can be approached in just theoretically, or practically. When we think about free trade, we usually tend to think about Adam Smith and the economists who are proponents of this way of thinking about economy. We rarely think about the real meaning of free market economy, which is strange, because already in the Bronze Age, in the eastern part of the Mediterranean especially, there were free trade going on, and flourishing between the Greeks and but especially among the Egyptians and the peoples of Mesopotamia. They were pretty much doing free trade. Of course, there were occasionally, locally, tolls and other payments that were due, to pay, and they were ordered. The tradesmen were ordered um, to pay them when visiting some trading cities and so on, or just passing on some, we would say, territorial waters, although territorial waters is a concept that started in the 17th century. But you know what I mean. They were already paying from time to time for the possibility of doing trade with some more distant locations, but basically it was totally free trade. Of course, there were different approaches. The Assyrians, for instance, they had some sort of societies of tradesmen, and they were even had their own deity. So they were organized in a very particular way. From when we look at it from our perspective of today's perspective, but that was pretty much free trade going on. And of course, the free trade ended a little bit when the so-called sea peoples arrived. The sea peoples who arrived in the 14th century before Christ were responsible for decline of many, let's say, civilizations. I would prefer to say cultures, like Egypt and so on, and part of Mesopotamia. There was a part in which the more distant parts that will form something that we call Persia today, that survived. They survived, and also those parts which were not really ancient Egypt, but rather parts of modern day Sudan, the people of black complexion, but they who were implementing elements of ancient Egyptian culture, they also survived. So the so-called kingdom of Kush. We don't know who were the sea peoples, but the sea peoples, we can presume that one of those peoples were the Philistines, that were the people who gave so much trouble to the Hebrew people, but also the people who gave the name, Palestine, to Palestine. So the Philistines. And this is probably the only sea people that we can, locate, or how to say it, that we can distinguish from the very vast and very not very precise term sea peoples. So but when the civilization, so to speak, rebuilt itself after this huge blow, it was already again very much free trade between various cultures and regions of the Eastern Mediterranean, first and foremost. So the Greeks, the Roman Empire was also pretty much free tradey, although we can, of course, spot some emperors who were thinking about trade in the more dictator-ish way, like the Emperor Diocletian, I don't know, who was of an opinion that all the prices should be fixed, and the prices for services, wages should be fixed. So there were emperors who were very distant from everyday life when it comes to prices, and from our modern perspective on those. Right. The other thing that I started, so you see that I started both the summary of today and the more particular material that the whole set of the lectures, from the just stating the maybe obvious fact that free trade, we can approach free trade from just purely philosophical, theoretical way, and we can also perspective, and we can also approach this from a technical, practical perspective. And if we do this, the latter, then it will mean that free trade is something of a default position that it's just a normal state of things, because I think it is. I am rather a social liberal than a classical liberal, but I still think that free trade is something like breathing. It's a default position of mankind, or humankind, as you prefer. Right. So this the second myth that I started by, just after demythologizing the free market thing, I also demythologize the other myth. The other myth is the socialist myth. It's this myth according to which it started mainly in Germany in late 19th century, not necessarily from Karl Marx himself, but from people who were representatives, who were continuing his philosophy. They were of an opinion that there are basically three stages of the human development when it comes to economy, and the first is, of course, the feudalism. The second one is capitalism, and the third one is socialism. I think this perspective is wrong. Is because feudalism is not really an economic position. It's some sort of arrangement when it comes to law and judging and things like that. It has little to do with economy. Feudalism is just a social system in which the people who are connected with noble titles or other fancy stuff are praised higher than people who are just tradesmen. So, for instance, in Europe, the whole administration of the kings and princes based on the strata of the knights, and almost the same in China, although there were just more, professional strata of administrators. They were the base of power in medieval China. So not tradesmen. In both cases, not the tradesmen. So feudalism is a little bit, it's not helping the free market economy. It's not helping the tradesmen. It's not helping the meritocracy when it comes to economic policies and so on. But we cannot really say that it's some sort of an economic thought. It is not. Feudalism is social thought. It's social construct. It's not an economic construct. So, and there were many sub versions of feudalism when it comes to economy and economical thought and theories. The second stage, according to the 19th century German socialists, would be, of course, capitalism. So it's this moment when usually, it was the moment in which the moment in which the first stock exchange markets emerged, mainly in the Netherlands, also professional banking systems, or maybe those semi-professional banking systems of Italy of 15th century, or maybe those totally professional systems developed in early 17th century Dutch Republic. And the third would be, of course, socialism with all its ideology and promises, which were rather not delivered. Although, of course, it provided in some countries, when mixed with liberalism and democracy, provided some social democratic elements which would make the Darwinian everyday life a little bit more mild and more easily beared. Okay, so The second myth, as you can see, is the myth that feudalism is some sort of an economic construct, and capitalism also. Capitalism was the term that were used specifically by late 19th century German socialists, so it's rather a slander than a scientific term. Free market economy is much better term. When it comes to socialism, we know that socialism is basically the new approach to state-driven economy, which was already tried under feudalism and capitalism, according to those terms already. So you see the whole construction, the whole concept of 19th century socialist German professor is falling apart already. So as you can see, capitalism is just a slander for free market. Socialism is just some new ideas how the government could run the economy, although mercantilism was something of a sort, to some extent at least. And mercantilism happened in the time of feudalism, or in the time of capitalism, or maybe it was a mixture. So we see that this whole giant edifice is already falling apart. Right. So when it comes to the countries and historical periods which are associated with feudalism, so let's say, for instance, medieval China or early modern China, we must distinguish the particular ages, particular centuries, which, when it comes to economy, were behaving in totally different way, and they were going totally different directions. For instance, when you take China, the United China under the Tang dynasty, that would be the end of, for instance, the end of the 17th century, basically 17th century, 7th century, 8th century, and 9th century, roughly. The Tang dynasty was a dynasty that was very much interested in trade and international relations, also economic relations, and they were very much engaged in this international trade. And one can argue that already in the 9th and 10th century, China is very much oriented to international trade. So it was feudal and capitalistic at the same time. So you can see that after the Mongol conquest, China was a little bit impoverished when it comes to a highly sophisticated culture, also in the terms of economy. But at least there was a continuation of the tolerant approach when it comes to religion. In Tang dynasty, it was because those rulers were tolerant themselves. In the times of Mongol Empire, it was because the Mongols were hesitant which religion they would like themselves to pick. But when it comes to those eras after the Yuan, the Mongol dynasty of China, was already abolished, or already finished, their influence on China was already gone. Then you have the Ming dynasty, and the Ming dynasty is something of a conundrum here, because the Ming dynasty was not so much focused on international trade, not as much as the Sung dynasty or the Tang dynasty in the past. And they were feudal and a little bit capitalist skeptical, free market skeptics. And when they were, of course, interested in some regional trade with Japan, with the Arabs, with some Indian states, I mean the states of India, there were many, to some extent with Southeast Asia. So all this region that we usually call the Indochina. That's so that the things that are between India and China. The term was coined, of course, in the 19th century. That was only so, but still we can call it Indochina. So they were pretty much trading very happily and with great enthusiasm with Southeast Asia, with Indochina, with the Arabs sometimes, with the Indians sometimes, Koreans, Japanese, and so on. But they were very much hesitated very much to do more trade on the larger scale with the Europeans. The first really serious presence, economic presence of the Europeans in China, it was the year 1510, because then it's the time when Vasco da Gama sailed to India and was interested in the regional trade, Asian trade. And during very, very shortly afterwards, the Portuguese gained control over the Sultanate of Malacca, so the part of modern day Indonesia and Malaysia. And they were pretty much trying to engage in the more serious, large-scale trade with the Chinese. And the Chinese were already satisfied in the when it comes to trade. On the local level, there was a high level of autarky, but when it comes to trade, they were pretty much satisfied with the local Asian trade. So they were not really looking for new contrahands. The Europeans have totally different perspective. The Europeans were trying to establish a large-scale trade with China because they wanted very much. They wanted very badly the spices, at first and foremost the spices. And the spices, because of that need for spices to preserve food better, there were no refrigerators back then. They were trying to establish this trade, but the Chinese were not really interested. The only thing that really made a bigger impression on the Chinese when it comes to things produced in Europe were the astronomic apparatus or apparata in the plural. All those machines which were used for astronomers' work, those were the only things that really impressed the Chinese, and the Chinese were very consistent in this interest. But when it comes to, I don't know, furniture or weaponry or some metal objects, different things that Europe could provide, they were not really interested. They were of an idea that maybe they shouldn't be deeper involved with the Europeans. By the way, in the 15th century, so let's go back a little bit. In the 15th century, of course, the Chinese were sailing across the world. The Zheng He, the admiral, who was himself a Muslim and a eunuch, he was engaged in all those naval operations, and he had many ships, like 200 of them during one mission or something like this. So totally no comparison to the small fleets of Vasco da Gama or Cristoforo Colombo. But so Zheng He was only interested in taking the good news of how powerful is the Emperor of China, and little more than that. So they were not really trade voyages, not really, and they were even getting to the eastern coast of Africa, the regions of modern day Mozambique, and so on. In the same time, in the 15th century, the Portuguese were penetrating the western coast of Africa, and it's a very funny thing that they never went. They never bypassed, neither of the sides bypassed the the Cup of the Good Hope, how it is in English, the what I mean, the Cup, the region in which the Kapstadt will be formed. Kapstadt will be formed in a 100 years, 150 years. So they never met, but it's a funny thing that they were exploring the coasts of Africa at the same time. All right, so the Europeans were consistent in their trying to open up China for trade with them. And the Chinese, just the other way around, especially the Manchu dynasty, the Qing dynasty, the Qing dynasty, they were not at all interested, and they were even limiting the trading with the Europeans. So, for instance, at the beginning of the 18th century, the Emperor Kangxi decided in the 1720s to limit the number of trading posts with the Europeans. So with the Russians, just one trading post really in Kyakhta, and with the Europeans, just one trading post in Canton or Guangzhou. It depends on if you use Cantonese or Mandarin Chinese. So just one trading post really. So that was going the different direction on the collision course really with what the Europeans wanted. So in 1793, the British special ambassador came, Lord George Macartney, a Scotsman. He went to China to impress with the new furniture, with the new apparata, with the new mechanisms, also those which were produced by the English Industrial Revolution. He presented all this fancy stuff to the Emperor Qianlong, or Qianlong or Qianlong. I'm not sure how to pronounce it because it's not always so consistent with this pinyin system. All right, but so the Emperor Qianlong or Qianlong, he was not at all impressed. He said that he already possessed what he wanted, basically, and just the astronomical stuff, as usual, would be gladly received in China. But when it comes to furniture and things like that, the things that could really, be about possible large-scale trade, that he's very much uninterested. So, of course, it was the collision course, and of course, the Europeans tried something different, because the problem was that apart from the Iberians, from the tradesmen of Spain and Portugal, so all the others, the Dutch, the English, and so on, they had not so much gold at the disposal. So the Spaniards and the Portuguese, they could simply pay gold for everything they wanted from the Chinese, for silk and spices and things like that. The Dutch and the English, they could, scarcely do it, because they had not so much gold mines and things like that. They didn't have Minas Gerais of Brazil. They didn't have Potosi of Bolivia. So they were in very hot water with those. So they spotted, that the Chinese are easily corrupted when it comes to narcotics, and the English, of course, they have cultivated crops, narcotics, opium in India, and the Americans were criticizing this idea all the time for humanitarian reasons, but they were doing it themselves, but they were just doing it in cahoots with Turkish cultivators of opium. So the Turkish farmers of opium and the American businessmen were working together in drugging the Chinese exactly as much, or maybe on a smaller scale, but it was a similar process than like the British were doing with Indian from their own India, um, you know, cultivations from farms, opium farms in India. So it was the only way to counterbalance without using just gold and silver. This how to counterbalance the situation, the trading deficit with China. So this, of course, happened in such a way that at the end of this process, China was opened in the 1840s, and Japan was also opened by the Americans, not the British, slightly a bit later, and so on. So in the same time, when let's go back to the 15th century, the countries that were the most professional when it comes to trade in 15th century were not really the Iberian countries who were doing all those fancy geographical discoveries like Spain and Portugal. They were rather people of the Netherlands, and initially mainly from the modern day Belgium. There were the people of Flanders, and they were very much interested in large-scale trade and manufacturing. They were the first people who thought about it. And the Netherlands, well, it's almost obvious, right? They are producing stuff because they are also interested in trade and in more elaborated items. I wanted to say items, because they have a problem with arable land, lack of it, and fighting with the sea. The Belgians have problems with mountainous terrain, not so very good for cultivation. So, but the Dutch, it's more extreme form. They have problem with arable land, the lack of it, and the lack of natural resources. And so the Dutch were pretty much interested in developing their own country through trade. And they all, of course, in time, they using the windmills and the other pumps, they gained much terrain from the sea. They regained or gained, depends on your perspective. They gained so much terrain from the sea that they called it polders, of course, and the polders are extremely good. It's extremely good soil for cultivation. But the Netherlands already in the late 16th century was independent when it comes to agriculture. So for such a small country with relatively big population as the Netherlands was and is, it was impressive. But still, you must remember that before that, they had to import most of those crops and agricultural stuff. So they had to engage themselves like 100% in trade, and then and only later they pretty much developed also agricultural element of their economy. So the Dutch maybe change a little bit their behavior when it comes to economy. The economy became more and more wholesome, but at the beginning it was very much trade oriented and manufacturing. And oriented on manufacturing, and manufacturing oriented and trade oriented, then agriculture and this typical European economic system of the age. The same goes to Italy. Italy also has this backbone of the mountains. We don't perceive the Italians as the people from the mountains, as highlanders, because 80% of the Italians today, for instance, they do not live in the mountains. They tend to live the vast majority of them tend to live along the coastlines, and also along the coastlines, and also they tend to live in the valleys of, for instance, River Pad, which is one of which is the only big port chunk of the good arable land in Italy, the Pad Valley. There are some smaller ones, but generally Italy is not really very much rich in natural resources and good arable land, far from it. So they also had to be concentrated on trade, because in order to survive and in order to enrich themselves. So it's no wonder that the people from Flanders, and then also from the Dutch Republic, and the people of Italy were exactly the people who invented modern day, let's say, capitalism, but I would prefer to say modern day free market economy. Of course, free market already was already a centuries old concept, but to be consciously free market oriented, that was something new. And the Italians concentrated on trading and banking system. The banking system was really something really new. Usually in the past, banking systems sort of were sometimes connected with the people of faith, with the clergymen of sorts, with the Templar Knights or something like that. And some in different, in ancient civilizations, ancient culture, I would prefer to say, that was connected sometimes. We could say, for instance, the ziggurats in Sumer, they were banks also. They were not just temples, they were banks as well. But the professional banking system was invented by the Italians in 15th century, basically. Maybe 14th century, but in 15th century in the more mature form. And the difference from today's banking system was that they were not separating at the initially. They did not separate the function of being tradesman and being a banker. So banker, of course, comes from the bench. In Italy, it's banca. Banca, it's the bench, because they were presenting their stuff, their merchandise on those benches. And if you wanted to buy it, but you didn't have enough money, then they would lend it to you. And you can borrow from them. And you could borrow from them. And the same guy, the tradesman, was also a banker. So he could, you could buy something on credit. Right. So, and it was the Dutch in the 16th century who totally separated those two roles, banker and a merchant. That was something new. That was a Dutch addition to the global economy history and to the history of economy. So, but even if some Northern European, let's say, maybe not Dutchman or Belgian, so to speak, but Flemish person, but because the Walloons were not really engaged in all those so much. The Flemish people were those who were engaged. And this culture of being a merchant or a banker was shared by all people who were speaking the language of Netherlands, the Dutch language. But when it comes to Italy, it was the region in the, let's say, 16th century when if you wanted to do something, well, maybe not globally, but in the whole of Europe, you wanted your business to expand to the whole of Europe, that you would probably had to, had to establish your company there. This is exactly what the family of the bankers from Augsburg, the Fuggers, the German bankers who very much renowned for the riches, and they were in proportion to the whole of the European economy, presented in numbers and in money. The Fuggers were richer than Elon Musk and Bernard Arnault and Jeff Bezos and the Rockefellers and so on of today are to the when in proportion to the riches of the world. So the Fuggers were really kings of bankers and kings of the rich people in every era. And the Fuggers, if they wanted to go really big, they had to establish their businesses in Venezia, of course, in Venezia, and their company was called not the Fugger Industrielle Firma und so weiter, but und not the, I don't know, Jakob Fugger und Söhne. No, the company was called Fondaco dei Tedeschi, was called Foundation of the Germans. This was the name of their company, Fondaco dei Tedeschi. Yeah, so it's not it's of course the example of a company which is very old. We even today we have some companies that really survived for all these years. The Fogger business disappeared in the course of the time, but we have, for instance, the family of Bettencourt. The French knight Jean de Bettencourt, he landed or stranded really on the island of Fuerteventura, and he called actually then it was in the early 15th century. Then he called this adventure Fort Aventure. He called it, strong stuff, so something like this. Yes, strong, powerful adventure, right? Something like this, Fort Aventure. Then the Spaniards came, of course, and they made this name more Spanish, but that was exactly the same name continued. And the Bettencourts are today the people of L'Oral, Garnier, Paris, Plémitude, Revitalit, Laboratoire, and so on. Those are the same people, the Bettencourts. So sometimes you have companies that run for 500 years. It's not so totally uncommon, but the Fuggers they didn't survive. They were replaced by bankers from Portugal, from Spain, from the Netherlands, England, and so on in the next century. Or even at the end of the already at the end of the 16th century, really. So you can see that those are the countries that didn't have so much arable land at their disposal. They were not the peoples who were really moving us forward when it comes to economic theory and practice. Those were rather the countries which had problems with arable land and natural resources, or the lack of it, really, like the Italians and the Dutch people and the so-called Belgian people, though Belgium as a concept was really a 19th century thing. So let's say the people from southern Netherlands. Also, not just the people of Holland. Far from it, it was rather the Antwerp who started all that, rather than Amsterdam, which came later and a little bit instead of Antwerp as a center of European trade. Right, so the people that I think are the most important when it comes to the history of economics are the people who are connected first and foremost with the great quarrel about mare clausum and mare liberum. Because if you want to have international free market, it would be probably a good idea to have also free seas, that the seas and oceans, although oceans it's something also as a 19th century concept, we usually They were just grand mer. They were just big seas or something like this. But still, so it would be recommendable to have also free sea fare, right? Right, like exactly like the rivers were free, because the rivers were free. You couldn't impose so easily tolls and some posts which would which would make you pay the toll or some other payment. So you could outmaneuver the feudal inner borders with the help of the river nets. The same with waters, right? It was a general assumption that maybe it would be just as well to use the salt water, salt water, like seas and so on. So the Dutch, who were already professionalizing the entire economy, they were creating at the beginning of the 17th century. They created the modern banking. They created the first modern bank, the Wissel Bank. It was Wissele means exchange currencies, because Wissel there was also some sort of the currency exchange point. So the Wissel Bank was the first more or less modern bank. And the Dutch also created at the beginning of the 17th century, more or less at the same time period, they created the first stock exchange market. So they were very much for professionalizing and making also this economy global and free, like borderless. The main character who represented this way of thinking was Heich Groot, which is known more in the Latinized version of his name, Hugo Grotius. He was very much for mare liberum. So he was of an idea that we should treat seas like some sort of a border-free thing. So, by the way, we treat today Antarctics as a mare liberum. We treat also the space as a mare liberum, really. So this idea about free seas, mare liberum, it's something comparable to the influence of Jesus or Muhammad on today's world. So Heich Groot was basically one of the prophets. He was indeed. But the English, for instance, who were a little bit weaker when it comes to trading, when it comes to merchant fleet and the other systems, they were of an idea that it would be probably recommendable to divide all seas like the land is divided. And John Selden was representing this point of view. He was very much for mare clausum. Clausum means closed. So he was for closed seas, mare clausum, like numerus clausus, right? Something like this. So mare clausum. And they were of an opinion that all the seas should be closed. And should be parts of the territory of a particular country. So there was, unavoidably, it had to be some sort of compromise. So we have both international and national waters today. And the idea being that the canon range would really dictate how much of the seas is national and how much is international, from the other end. Right. So, and it was changing for many years and decades. It was changing. The national waters were expanding because the range of the more and more powerful, even still more and more powerful cannons. New models were developed. The range was bigger and bigger, so the range of national waters also. The other interesting characters, the other interesting personalities that I require my students to know something about were, for instance, Thomas Moon and Jean-Baptiste Colbert, respectively from England and France, the people who were distrustful of an disorganized trade. They were of an opinion that it would be probably a nice thing to engage the government into the economic policy of a land. And Jean-Baptiste Colbert, he was working for many years as tradesman in his youth, as tradesman in Lyon, and he knew, totally had a very deep knowledge of free market economy there in Lyon, and he was distrustful of the system, and his advice was to engage the government and to make the manufacturers and so on, which would be state-owned and state-driven, which and the general idea was that economy is something like a zero-sum game. Today we are always talking about expanding markets, but in those days it was not so easy from one decade to another to spot the real growth in the entire economy of a region, not to mention global. There were not, it was not really yet age of statistics. The statistics had to be invented, and it was invented and applied more broadly by France and Sweden in the 18th century, whereas the other countries were still very much behind even in 18th century. So those were the times when statistics was not really very much helpful because it was practically non-existent. So Jean-Baptiste Colbert offers an opinion that it would be nice if government would come here and dictate a little bit the national economic policies, especially because French nobility, French aristocrats, French noblemen were not really very much interested in trade. They thought that it was a little bit beneath their dignity. So he wanted to create an additional elite of administrators and tradesmen who were becoming a little bit like the English gentry, so something between noblemen and tradesmen. So it was formed naturally in England because of the Two Rose War, when the aristocracy pretty much eliminated itself and tradesmen had to form naturally some sort of new aristocracy, and they were of course tradesmen, so they were not hostile to trade. And Jean-Baptiste Colbert had to do the same artificially, and this approach was copied later on by Frederick the Great and the other enlightened autocrats of the 18th century. Right, and the Austrians in the times of Jean-Baptiste Colbert and his experiments, the Austrians, they have noted that Austria is very much behind when it comes to economic thought and economic policies. So the Austrians, like, let's say, Wilhelm von Schröder or Philipp Hoernig, there were some others yet, but those are the most important ones. Wilhelm von Schröder and Philipp Hoernig. They, I don't remember which one of those said that Österreich could be really über alles, if only wanted. That meant that the whole economic policy of the day was that the whole economic model of the day in in Austria was constructed in a crazy way from our modern perspective, and even from the perspective of the Dutch or the English of that era. Because it was like in Poland, almost none economic policies really, but it was very much the reversed protectionism, like the anti-protectionism. If you were running a manufacturer in, let's say, Austria in, let's say, 1680s, you would have a very crazy situation on your head, because you would have to pay additional tolls to get your merchandise out of the country to be sold to some other peoples, like to the French or to Italians or something. So you were rather punished for for your productivity. Whereas the aristocracy, which were running everything back then in Austria, the aristocracy was only interested in the situation that they would not pay additional fees for goods that they imported for their pleasure. So the so-called Kameralisten, like the Schröder and like Wilhelm von Schröder and Philipp Hörnig, had to turn the table and had to install some sort of conscious, for the first time, conscious way of thinking about economy and so on. Schröder and Hörnig, they are the Kameralisten. This school is called Kameralistik. It was continued in 18th century under the name of the Polizisten and so on. So it's the separate way of thinking. It's of course subtype of mercantilism, and they were pretty much combining administrative and economic rules of the state. So it was even further going than Colbert's ideas. Right. So, and then in the late 17th century, we would have the first fully conscious, self-conscious, free market economists. Some of them were proposing, they were advising that free market should be applied to all departments of human activity, and some were just here and there. But for instance, Nicolas Barbon, he was in late 17th century England. He already basically told everything what in 18th century will be told by Hume and Adam Smith. He told that free market is just working better, and that the markets could be expanded. So this zero-sum game is not really the thing, and the expanding markets is something good, and free market is something good. And you don't have to treat economy like some sort of a war and zero-sum game. In France, the physiocrats like François Quesnay and Anne-Robert Turgot, they were thinking that free market economy is to be applied to agriculture, to agricultural market, and to mining, because they were first and foremost of an opinion that the real economy is mining and agriculture, and things like manufacturing and things like international trade or even local trade were something of an addition to the most important stuff, which were mining and agriculture. So the French were applying very much consciously the free market ideas, but they were just making just a how to say it, were making compartments of those. It was a compartmentalization of it, right? So just for mining and agriculture. But they very much influenced the other thinkers. And in Sweden, for instance, in 18th century Sweden, when the parliament got much more power than before, it was the so-called Frihetstiden, the age of freedom. That meant that everything was run pretty much by the parties and politicians in the Riksdagen. The so-called Hattpartiet, the aristocrats who were interested in trade, they were which were running the party. They were pretty much all mercantilists, like Karl Gyllenborg or people like that, or Anders von Hübken and so on, and things like people like that. But there were also economic thinkers which were engaged in the political life of the other party, the Muspartiet, and one of those were the economist Anders Hydenius. Anders Hydenius was particularly active in 1750s and 1760s. So before Adam Smith, he already very much vindicated all the Smithian ideas before Smith. And by the way, David Hume also presented basically all the ideas of Adam Smith before Adam Smith in the 1740s, so even a little bit earlier than Anders Hydenius. What really makes Adam Smith so particular and so interesting is not that he invented something new, because he invented nothing new, but that he dragged on for hundreds of pages about the wealth of nations. This is the thing, and he made it into a Bible of free market oriented economists, and he highly, I wanted to say, heavily influenced one of the most powerful politicians of his age, that would be William Pitt the Younger, who started to be Prime Minister of England in 1780s. And William Pitt applied those policies. And that's really what makes Adam Smith interesting, that he got to the people of government with his ideas. It was the good timing, because William Pitt was trying to, clear the mess after the war, against the American colonists. When the Americans got their independence, and the British had to be focused on some new projects, like conquering of Bengal and the whole of India, like organizing the colony in Australia. Australia would probably never come to being, maybe, if not America declared independence, had America never declared independence in the first place. So it was good timing for new ideas. And those new ideas, and there is only, I would think that in 19th century, there is only one very important free trade economist, that would be David Ricardo. David Ricardo was a proponent of a thesis that you would have a specialization of each and every country. So it's not, so if you have free economy, it's not a tragedy for some countries and a blessing for other countries. Each and every country will have their specializations. And because of that, we can say that David Ricardo was a happy inventor of a happy version of globalization, economic globalization. So that would be the most important guy when it comes to 19th century economy. And I would say that almost no one was so important, maybe only John Maynard Keynes, and maybe but in the negative way this time, the so-called liberals from Manchester, which were more free marketeers from Manchester, in the like Richard Cobham, who really turned economy, free market economy, into some sort of a religion that you should never be regulated or anything. So, but it's in more negative way. But in the positive way, when it comes to scientific thinking and not religious thinking, we can say that most important economist of the 19th century was, of course, David Ricardo, and in uh, 20th century, of course, John Maynard Keynes. There were those who really made the difference. By the way, in the last part of the 18th century, when William Pitt was implementing already the ideas of Adam Smith, the free market ideas, Americans went the other direction. Americans went through went 100% protectionism, and protectionism is basically the son of mercantilism. So the Americans, first and foremost, Alexander Hamilton, his main rival, Jefferson, was not so keen on economics. He was no expert on economy. He was interested in physiocrats' ideas, but he had no real influence on economy. So the economy was organized according to the advice given by Alexander Hamilton, and his visions are Colbertian, basically. He was for protectionism. He was especially on the international stage, which is also to some extent understandable because America was very much behind the other countries in the last part of the 18th century, because the Americans, they revolted against Great Britain precisely because they were not allowed to have large scale manufacturing. So they were technologically behind Britain and behind most of Western Europe. So they had to be protectionists to some level and to some extent, and Alexander Hamilton was doing precisely that. And the funny thing is that the British, they preserved throughout the 19th century, basically the whole of the 19th century, they preserved this Smithian and Pittian, attitude of William Pitt and Adam Smith and David Ricardo, or even Richard Cobham, to have totally free economy. Because when you think, for instance, about the Industrial Revolution, it gave the unique position to Great Britain because they were so much technologically advanced in comparison to other countries. So they were, making the most of this situation. They were not inclined, just like this, the Dutch, who were the first traders of the world in the 17th century. The English in the 19th century, especially the first half of the 19th century, they were pretty much satisfied with free market economy in both theory and practice. And they were not really doing much when it comes to government's role in the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution pretty much was the child of just individuals who were interested in these things, like the Abraham Darby or Robert Hargraves or Thomas Newcomen, or Robert Hargraves used the steam machine to produce, clothing on the mass scale. Abraham Darby in the new types of coal and power and so on. Stevenson and the rocket, the first locomotive, like the serious locomotive, because the first steam-engined vehicle was Fardier-Vepère from France, not the English project, but still the real first locomotive, which was maybe not mass produced, but produced in many copies, was the rockets of Stevenson. So those were inventors which were not really supported by the government. They were using their own money, basically. So it was like mm, like a swarm of ideas, individual ideas and engagements, right? And engagement. So, and exactly for this reason, the British were in the last quarter of the 19th century already behind the Germans, the French, and the Americans, and the Japanese, because all those four nations discovered the government support for industry and implementing industrial new methods and things like that to finance industry and to put it into life as quickly as possible. And the British, they were thinking that it's not the proper way to do. They stayed focused mainly on trade, and their banks were, well, it can be shocking to you, but the Bank of England in the last decades of the 19th century, where the Bank of England was rather smallish in comparison to the Crédit Mobilier or the German Deutsche Bank or even Dresdner Bank. So it was all on the smaller scale. So the British, even when Australia at the last 3 decades of the 19th century, they wanted 100 something locomotives from the British. They got just 15 or something, and they had to order like 40 or 50 from the United States because the Britain was, everything was working to too small a scale, and Britain had to also to build railroads in India and other colonies, so they were it was underinvested all the time. So it's funny that the same thing which was special about the English ingenuity and individual genius, it at the end eventually it was the reason of how the reason why Britain was surpassed by America, Germany, France, and so on. But the funny thing is that Britain was pretty much not very habitable place, especially in northern England, before the revolution and before warming up the the apartments and so on. So that's that. So this is basically the stuff that I was trying to teach, and I hope that they learned all that. And I also recommended to the group that I teach economic history, so they also dig up a little bit, do a little bit work of their own to dig up some new information on the given phenomenon that I wrote on the tables and more important historic figures when it comes to history of economy. And I hope that we will do just that in sufficiently to pass the exam successfully, because I really hate giving bad grades or bad notes or bad marks, as you prefer. The British say marks, the Americans say grades. Yeah, and I focus as a lecturer. I focus usually on understanding the process. There are many types of processes that can be understood, and I really the whole idea is to understand the process. They can use their own language. They do not have by no means to use the buzzwords and so on. They are just to understand. I expect them just to understand the process, and I think that it's the modern type of teaching, and I am very much for that. And I think there is too little of that in the Polish, and not just Polish, basically in education these days and for many decades now. So it's not about the form in which the teaching takes place. It's more about the the process and not the just remembering some particular information and then just forgetting them. Right. So and if you want, because you sometimes ask me about the tips of how to learn something, I would recommend just that. I would recommend to understand the process and why something happened more and less on the things that had to do with a proper name of some phenomenon or buzzwords or scientific, definitions and so on, and more on the process. Right. So that's that. Economic history is much more complicated than the other subject that I am lecturing about. That would be the other is economic geography. I will summarize it probably in the. I will summarize it in a minute, but I had to prepare a tea for my throat, in order to make it work better. And so see you soon about economic, and I will tell you some interesting, I hope, facts about economic geography, and you will get also some sort of perspective of how I visualization or something, how I teach also that, because we were asking about that also. So see you soon, and so see you soon.